My name is David Sanderson, and I've spent most of my life solving other people's financial messes. After 35 years as a certified public accountant, you'd think I'd know when something doesn't add up. I guess that's why it nags at me so much, this feeling that something in my life, my own life, just doesn't fit. Maybe it's my way of filling my days now that I'm retired, or maybe I've just got too much time on my hands. Or maybe I'm right. I'd always thought of my marriage to Laura as something reliable, a constant. We've been together for nearly 35 years, raised two wonderful kids who've since moved away and started families of their own. Laura's a capable woman, smart and hardworking, and we've always had a comfortable life. She's still involved in her work with the local art museum, something she's passionate about, but even that has always fit in seamlessly with our routines. Until recently. It started a few months ago, maybe half a year if I'm honest. Laura had begun talking about needing time for herself. It seemed innocent enough. She'd started going out more often, meeting friends for lunch, and even taking weekends away for what she called rejuvenating retreats. At first, I didn't think much of it. She deserved a break after all those years spent juggling her job, the house, and the kids. But then certain things started to shift. Little details that didn't seem important on their own, but nagged at me collectively. One evening, I'd been out for a walk when I spotted her in a coffee shop downtown, one she doesn't usually frequent. She was sitting in the corner, leaning across the table, animated, her hands in motion as she spoke to a man I didn't recognize. From where I stood outside, their conversation looked intense, their faces close together. Something about it gave me pause, but when I asked her about it that evening, she brushed it off as a work meeting and changed the subject quickly. Still, the image of her laughing so freely with a stranger stuck in my mind. The next strange occurrence came a few weeks later. I had gone in her office at home to look for a book I thought she might have borrowed. On her desk was an envelope from an upscale resort a few hours out of town, one I knew well from business conferences. I recognized the logo immediately. This wasn't any ordinary bed and breakfast. It was the kind of place where people went to impress someone or escape. When I asked about it, she laughed and said she'd found a discount rate. "Why not pamper myself a little?" she'd said. I let it slide, but something inside me kept nudging me to look deeper. Then came the anniversary incident. This year, we were supposed to celebrate it together, maybe at the restaurant we've been going to for decades. But 2 days before, Laura mentioned, almost offhandedly, that she wouldn't be able to make it. "I'm sorry, David," she said with a soft, apologetic smile. "But there's a conference that weekend with some museum donors. I know it's terrible timing, but I have to go." I wanted to say something to press her on it, but I didn't. Maybe that was a mistake. The night of our anniversary, I went out alone to the restaurant, replaying our conversation in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Laura and I had always made time for each other on special days, and this was the first year she'd so easily brushed it off. As I sat there, I started to wonder, how long had these little signs been here, and how had I missed them? The next morning, I decided it was time to do what I did best, pay attention to the details. I wasn't going to sit idly by while my gut told me something was wrong. If there was one thing I knew from years in finance, it was that the smallest inconsistency could reveal the largest secrets. And this time, I wasn't going to let anything slip by me. That morning, I sat down with a cup of coffee, a notepad, and a resolve I hadn't felt in years. If there was anything to discover, it would be buried in those little, seemingly meaningless details Laura had been trying to keep hidden. I decided to start with her rejuvenation weekends, which had started happening more frequently. Laura usually left on a Friday evening, saying she'd be back by Sunday. Each time she returned, she seemed more distant, but there was always some glowing story about the beautiful hikes or the inspiring workshops. Yet, I noticed she never brought back so much as a brochure or a trinket from any of these places. No sign that she'd even been to these retreats. My first move was to check out her favorite places online. I searched the names of the weekend retreats she'd mentioned before. One by one, they turned up on a quick search, but not a single one matched the description she'd given me. The cabins she described as rustic and secluded were, in fact, located in bustling little towns, far from the isolation she'd told me about. Then there was the matter of her spending. Laura had her own credit card, separate from our joint account, something I had insisted on early in our marriage to give her a sense of financial independence. But I knew she was meticulous about keeping receipts for her personal expenses. On a hunch, I went through the drawer in her office where she kept her financial papers. There were receipts all right, but not one from the supposed retreats. There was, however, a receipt from a high-end restaurant in a town that was hours away from where she claimed to be staying. It was dated on one of the weekends she had been rejuvenating. I carefully copied down the address, folding the note into my pocket. This was my first real lead. Over the next few days, I noticed Laura acting increasingly cautious around me. She was guarding her phone closely, never leaving it on the kitchen counter like she used to. Her demeanor shifted subtly, almost as if she could sense that I was onto something. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and she seemed more easily irritable, giving quick, clipped answers whenever I asked about her plans. I decided it was time to take my sleuthing further. I had to confirm, beyond any doubt, what was really going on. One morning, I mentioned that I'd be out late the next evening, visiting an old friend. I told her not to wait up. When the time came, I left the house as planned, drove to a nearby parking lot, and waited. If my suspicions were correct, Laura would be slipping away tonight for one of her mysterious outings. A few hours later, Laura's car pulled out of the driveway. Keeping a safe distance, I followed her down the winding roads of our quiet suburb, through the main town, and out toward the highway. She was driving toward that very town where I'd found the restaurant receipt, but there was something strange. She pulled into a strip mall parking lot, which was deserted at this time of night. She got out of her car and looked around before walking into a small cafe. It wasn't the kind of place Laura would usually choose. After about 15 minutes, a man walked into the cafe and headed straight to her table. They sat close, heads bent together, talking in a way that seemed far too familiar for comfort. The man was tall, gray-haired, and wore a crisp suit, definitely not someone she'd run into at a weekend retreat. I took out my phone and snapped a few photos. The man's face was turned away, but Laura's expression said it all, a look of warmth and admiration that had been missing from our marriage for a long time. I watched him for a while longer before heading home. The truth was out there, but I still needed more. This man, whoever he was only the beginning of what I was about to uncover. The next morning, I woke up before dawn, my mind still buzzing with images of Laura and the stranger at the cafe. This wasn't just a coincidence, and it wasn't my imagination either. But if I was going to confront her about this, I needed all the cards on my side of the table. So I started digging deeper. I spent the next few days slipping into my old accountant habits, piecing together details as if they were puzzle pieces. The receipt from the upscale restaurant, her vague mentions of donor meetings, and now this midnight rendezvous with a mystery man. It was all beginning to form a clear picture, but there were still gaps I needed to fill. I decided to take things a step further. That morning, while she was out on errands, I headed into the garage and opened the glove compartment of her car. I wasn't quite sure what I was looking for. Maybe another receipt, or perhaps a note she'd stashed away without thinking. And that's when I found it, a small, crumpled valet ticket from a hotel in the same town where she'd met the stranger at the cafe. This wasn't a run-of-the-mill hotel. It was one of those luxurious boutique spots people went to for weekend getaways. It was a place with rooms that had floor-to-ceiling windows, in-room fireplaces, and city views. A place you'd go to impress someone. My hands tightened around the ticket, a sense of betrayal washing over me. And yet, at that moment, I felt an eerie calm settle in. I was getting closer to the truth. Now, I had the name of a hotel and a date. If she'd been there with this man, there had to be a way to confirm it. So, I decided to pay the hotel a visit. I dressed in a suit that afternoon and made my way to the city. Walking into the hotel, I felt a strange mixture of anger and determination. I wasn't the kind of man who felt comfortable in these situations, but I had to know for sure. At the front desk, I put on my best calm and confident expression. "Good afternoon," I said to the receptionist, glancing at her name tag. "My wife, Laura Sanderson, stayed here recently, but I think she may have left an item behind. We're traveling tomorrow, and I'd hate for her to lose something important. I'd like to check if it's here." She hesitated, looking me over carefully, but after a moment she nodded. "What's the date she was here?" "Last Friday," I replied smoothly, the date from the valet ticket on the tip of my tongue. She typed into the computer, nodding after a moment. Yes, she was here, checked in under her own name. Then, just as I hoped, she added, she didn't list any lost items, but if she stayed with another guest, they might have checked out separately. Sometimes they're registered under the other person's name. I nodded, the confirmation landing like a punch in my gut. She was here with someone else. On the drive back, my mind raced. It was one thing to suspect, to see little signs that hinted at betrayal, but now I had concrete evidence. Laura had spent that Friday night in a luxury hotel with another man, while I'd been sitting at home, trusting her completely. That evening, I didn't mention a word of what I'd discovered. I ate dinner with her, made small talk, and even kissed her goodnight, all while the weight of the truth sat heavy inside me. I was going to keep my calm, but I'd already made up my mind. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. If she thought she could keep this secret hidden, she was about to see how wrong she was. In the days that followed, I played my part perfectly, watching, waiting, and collecting every small piece of evidence I could. Laura's demeanor toward me had softened, almost as if she sensed something had shifted. She'd give me warm smiles over breakfast, ask me about my day, even suggest we go out to dinner. But all I could see were the lies behind those smiles. One evening, after she left for one of her so-called donor meetings, I decided to look further into the mysterious man from the cafe. I didn't have much to go on, just his appearance and the few scant details I'd seen that night. But I knew the circles Laura moved in, especially when it came to her work at the art museum. If he was anyone of importance in that world, I'd find him. After a few hours of online research, combing through social media, and looking up recent museum events, I finally struck gold. There was a photo of Laura at a gala hosted by the museum a few months back, standing beside a man who looked eerily familiar. His name, listed in the caption, was Thomas Gray, an art philanthropist and board member for the museum. My heart sank as I stared at the screen. Here was the man who had likely been sitting across from her at the cafe that night, the same man she'd likely met at that luxury hotel. Now that I had a name, I needed to get creative. If he was a prominent figure in her world, it wouldn't take much to find out what he was up to. As I dug deeper, I found an article where he discussed an upcoming event he'd be attending, another museum fundraiser scheduled for the following weekend. And that gave me an idea. When Laura returned home that night, she slipped into bed beside me with her usual cool calm, as if the day had been perfectly uneventful. Busy day? I asked, keeping my voice light. She smiled, closing her eyes. Oh, exhausting. Too many meetings as always. I might have to be out a bit next weekend for another fundraiser, she added, her voice low and dismissive, as though it was of no real consequence. I gave her a nod. Well, don't wear yourself out too much. I'll manage here, I said, making sure my tone stayed as steady as hers. When Saturday arrived, Laura was all dressed up, preparing to leave for her fundraiser. I watched her put on the final touches, her dress, the expensive perfume she'd bought recently, and the necklace I'd given her years ago. She caught me watching her in the mirror and offered a soft smile. I won't be too late tonight, she said. No worries, I replied, smiling back. Have a great time. As soon as she left, I grabbed my coat and followed her. I had a hunch she wasn't just going to some regular museum event, not after the details I'd uncovered about Thomas Gray. If I was right, she'd be meeting him tonight. I kept a safe distance as I tailed her through town, until she arrived at a swanky hotel downtown, the same one that had hosted the gala months back. I parked a block away, watching as she greeted Thomas at the entrance, her face lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in years. It was confirmation. Laura wasn't just casually seeing this man. There was something deeply familiar, something intimate, in the way they looked at each other, in the way she leaned in as they laughed together. They disappeared through the lobby doors, and I sat there in my car, trying to make sense of it all. I'd imagined this moment, thought I'd feel fury or the urge to storm in and confront them both. But instead, a cold calm settled over me. After a few minutes, I started my car and drove away. I didn't need to see more to know the truth. But now that I knew exactly who her secret lover was, I could plan my next steps carefully. She wanted a life of secrets and shadows? Fine. But soon, she'd understand that every action had consequences. The days that followed were some of the hardest I'd ever lived. I knew what Laura was up to, yet I was forced to act like the oblivious, dutiful husband she expected me to be. The betrayal gnawed at me, but I kept my cool, biding my time. If she was trying to build a secret life with Thomas Gray, she'd soon learn how fragile that life truly was. I spent the next week gathering as much information as I could. I looked through old financial statements, tracking Laura's spending. The receipts she hadn't discarded gave me more than enough. High-end restaurants, extravagant clothing stores, and even tickets for a Broadway show 2 cities over on the same weekend she'd told me she was visiting her sister. Each new discovery fed my determination. But I wanted something undeniable, something that would not only expose her lies but would give me leverage. So, I took a page from her own book of secrecy. I decided to get to know Thomas's world a little better. As it turned out, Thomas had recently hosted an exhibit at a private gallery in the heart of town. The gallery had a small opening reception scheduled that Friday, with a guest list full of art enthusiasts, socialites, and donors. So, I made a few calls, leaned on some connections, and got myself an invitation. If Laura was going to walk into the lion's den, then so would I. Only I'd be the one holding the keys to the cage. When Friday came, I dressed up and headed to the gallery. The place was crowded, bustling with polished conversations and clinking champagne glasses. After a few minutes of scanning the room, I spotted Thomas, schmoozing with a few patrons, his arm resting casually around a woman I assumed to be his assistant. My stomach twisted as I imagined him doing the same to Laura. I didn't make a move right away. I watched him from afar, observing every expression, every subtle gesture. He was a man who exuded confidence, used to getting what he wanted, and for a moment, I wondered if Laura was just one more conquest for him, a trophy to flaunt. As I watched him move through the crowd, I made my way to a quieter corner, near the back hallway, until I was standing by the coat check. Moments later, I spotted Laura walking in, glancing around nervously before her eyes settled on Thomas. She walked up to him with a smile, her expression warming as he pulled her in for a discreet embrace. They slipped through the crowd toward the private hall where I stood. I kept myself hidden, listening as they murmured, laughing softly, the intimacy between them undeniable. They moved past me, unaware of my presence, and disappeared down the hall to a room marked private. The nerve of it all struck me like a cold wind. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. As soon as they were inside, I pulled out my phone and dialed the number of a private investigator I'd contacted earlier in the week. I decided to cover my bases. He was nearby, ready to document everything. Within minutes, he was snapping photos from an adjoining rooftop, capturing their cozy little rendezvous from an angle they'd never suspect. This was all I needed, but my plan didn't end with photos and proof. I wanted them both to feel the weight of their actions, psychologically, socially, and financially. The photos were my ace in the hole, but I had other plans to ruin the carefully curated lives they both held dear. When I got home that night, I poured myself a glass of scotch, the pictures from the investigator safely stored on a secure drive. Laura returned later, her face flushed, her smile serene as she kissed me goodnight. She had no idea her little world was about to come crashing down. The next morning, I started laying the groundwork for the revenge I'd been carefully crafting in my mind. Laura and Thomas had both built their lives on appearances, and I knew that tearing down their facades would hurt them far more than any angry confrontation ever could. I wanted them to see everything they valued, reputation, social standing, financial stability, crumble right in front of them. To begin with, I needed to ensure the photos would be put to effective use. I reached out to a trusted friend of mine, Peter, who worked in IT security. We'd known each other for years, and he owed me a favor from a long-ago business venture. I didn't give him many details. I just told him I needed certain photos sent anonymously and untraceably when the time came. Peter agreed, curious but smart enough not to press me for details. With his help, I'd have all the anonymity I needed to carry out the next part of my plan. My next step was more delicate. Laura had become well-connected in the local art scene, largely thanks to Thomas's influence. Her career had taken off in recent years, and she'd just been appointed to the board of trustees for a prominent local arts organization. That was a position she prized and bragged about endlessly, a status symbol that gave her access to exclusive circles, dinners, and events. I knew that exposing her affair with Thomas would be more than enough to destroy her standing within those circles. A scandal like this would send her entire social network into a frenzy. People would start questioning her commitment to the arts, her loyalty, and her integrity. But I wanted this to unfold slowly, like a spider tightening its web. So, I began drafting an anonymous letter to the board, complete with photos as evidence. The letter would suggest an inappropriate relationship between two board members that was compromising the organization's integrity. The more I planned, the calmer I felt. Every detail, every calculated step brought me closer to the moment I'd imagined since I first saw them together. This wasn't about making her hurt. It was about letting her see the life she'd chosen fall apart. And I wasn't finished yet. A week later, I learned that Thomas's company, an investment firm, was working on a merger. It was a highly sensitive deal with another firm, and any whiff of scandal around his name could put the entire merger in jeopardy. With a little digging, I found that Thomas's role in the merger was substantial, particularly because of his reputation for being upstanding. His affair with Laura would be more than enough to ruin the perception of his character and credibility. So, I composed another letter, this time to the executive team of Thomas's firm. I'd send it along with a copy of the photos, just enough to suggest that their golden boy might not be the man he pretended to be. With everything in place, I set the timer on the emails to go out in a staggered order. The first would hit the art board next Monday, just in time to stir up whispers and questions before the monthly board meeting. A few days later, Thomas's firm would get their email. It would be a slow drip of destruction, enough to give them both time to realize that something was happening without knowing where the blows were coming from. The day before the first email was set to go out, Laura brought up the possibility of us taking a weekend getaway to reconnect. Her words sounded hollow to me, just another attempt to smooth over her double life. I told her I'd think about it, and then watched her walk away, unaware of what was coming. That Sunday night, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction. I'd laid my plans carefully, methodically, and tomorrow the first domino would fall. It was only a matter of time before she and Thomas realized just how fragile their secret lives truly were. Monday morning arrived, and with it, the start of the fallout. The first email hit the art organization's board just as they were preparing for their monthly meeting. Peter had set the email to come from a private, encrypted account, and as I'd requested, it included a selection of photos with a brief, anonymous note. I regret to inform you that a personal relationship between board members Laura Sanderson and Thomas Gray has compromised the integrity of our organization. Photos attached. Concerned parties may wish to investigate further. It wasn't long before I heard from Laura. She called around lunchtime, her voice shaken. "David," she began, her tone a blend of fear and anger. "Something happened at work today. Someone sent an email to the board, claiming that I'm having an affair with Thomas." I stayed calm, even a little distant. "An affair? With Thomas?" "That's ridiculous, Laura," I said, keeping my tone skeptical. "Why would someone say something like that?" She hesitated. "I don't know. Someone's trying to ruin me, David. Maybe someone at the museum who doesn't like my position. Someone envious." Her response was almost laughable. After all these months of lying to my face, here she was grasping at excuses that didn't make an ounce of sense. I listened patiently as she spun her story about jealous colleagues and vindictive rivals, all while denying any connection with Thomas. It was clear she didn't realize how much evidence was waiting to unravel her story completely. Over the next few days, things got even more interesting. On Wednesday, the second email landed in the inbox of Thomas's executive team, complete with photos that left little to interpretation. By noon, Thomas's entire world was on fire. It didn't take long for word to get out about the scandal, and suddenly he wasn't just dealing with questions from his executives, but whispers from his colleagues and even the press. This was no minor inconvenience. His merger deal was in jeopardy, and with it, the reputation he'd built over the years. Thomas was a man who valued appearances above all else, and now those appearances were in tatters. But what came next was a bonus I hadn't anticipated. Late that Wednesday night, just as I was getting ready to call it a day, Laura stormed into the house, her face flushed with anger. Without a word, she dropped her purse on the counter and looked at me, her expression filled with desperation and fury. "David, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. "About what, Laura?" I replied calmly, though I could feel my pulse quickening. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. She took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "Someone's trying to destroy me, destroy us. They're spreading lies about me and Thomas, and I think they might try to target you next." I looked at her, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel an ounce of sympathy. "Lies? Laura, I don't know what's going on with you and Thomas, but maybe you should ask yourself why someone would even think to spread those lies in the first place." Her eyes widened, but she quickly composed herself. "Are you saying you believe this? You actually believe I'd do something like that?" I held her gaze, steady and unflinching. "I'm saying that if someone is spreading these stories, there's probably a reason they believe them. Maybe you should think about what you've been doing that could make people question your loyalty." For the first time since her affair began, Laura seemed genuinely unsettled. Her mask slipped just for a second, and I saw fear in her eyes. But she quickly covered it up, forcing a smile and attempting to look composed. "David, you know me. You know I would never." But I cut her off. "Maybe I don't know you as well as I thought." She tried to argue, to plead, but I walked past her and headed upstairs, leaving her standing alone in the kitchen. For the first time, she was faced with the possibility that her carefully constructed double life was coming undone. As I closed the door to our bedroom, I felt an overwhelming sense of satisfaction. The pieces were falling into place exactly as I'd planned. The emails had done their work, but now Laura was beginning to feel the weight of her own actions pressing down on her. This was only the beginning. The fallout from the emails kept escalating. By the end of the week, Laura's reputation was on thin ice at the art organization, and Thomas's firm had issued a press statement delaying the merger indefinitely, pending internal investigations. Their worlds were cracking, but I wasn't finished yet. I wanted them both to face the truth of their actions, and I wanted Laura to feel exactly what it was like to live with secrets, with the uncertainty that at any moment everything could fall apart. Laura, of course, was scrambling to regain control. The night after our tense exchange in the kitchen, she came into the living room, her face drawn and pale, trying to paint herself as the victim. "David, I think we need to go to the police," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "This has gone too far." I looked at her with calm indifference. "The police? Laura. And tell them what? That someone's calling you out on something you didn't do? Or is there more to this that I'm missing?" Her eyes flashed with anger and desperation, and she dropped her voice to a pleading tone. "David, I know it sounds strange, but someone's targeting me, trying to ruin everything I've worked for. Don't you think that's reason enough?" I couldn't hold back a slight smirk. "Well, I guess it's just that I didn't realize how much work you'd been putting into this art world of yours. But if someone's trying to expose a secret, you'd better be sure there isn't one to find." She started to reply, but then stopped, shaking her head in frustration. "I thought you'd understand. I thought you'd support me." Without another word, she left the room, and I knew I'd gotten under her skin. It was clear she felt cornered, and that fear was starting to show in every action, every word. But even now, she still refused to confess, to face the reality of what she'd done. Over the weekend, I kept my distance. I wanted her to feel isolated, unsure, left to her own devices as she tried to figure out what was happening. Each time I'd catch her looking at me, she wore a haunted expression, as if she was trying to guess how much I knew. I remained calm, casual, acting as if everything was fine. Monday arrived, and I knew the timing was right for the next move. I hadn't seen her lover, Thomas, since the emails were sent out, and I suspected he was hiding away, trying to avoid the scandal and minimize the damage. But I had a feeling he'd reach out to her soon, and I wasn't wrong. That evening, Laura left her phone on the kitchen counter while she was in the shower. A message notification popped up, and there it was, a text from Thomas. "We need to talk. This is getting out of hand. Call me as soon as you can." I couldn't resist. I swiped the notification, opening the message thread. It was littered with texts from him, his panic seeping through each one. Who could be behind this? This could ruin everything. Did you tell anyone about us? But the last message made me pause. I'll find out who's doing this. I have connections, and once we know who's behind it, they'll regret it. I felt a wave of satisfaction. He was scared, defensive, looking for someone to blame, just the reaction I'd hoped for. I took a quick photo of the messages with my own phone and put hers back exactly as I'd found it. When she came back to the kitchen, she didn't notice a thing. I wanted her to go to him, to lean on him, because soon I'd make sure they both went down together. That Friday, I sent Thomas one final anonymous message, this time from a different email, making sure it couldn't be traced back to me. I'd kept this email short and to the point. Everyone knows about you and Laura. Her husband is closer to the truth than you think. TikTok. The message would rattle him, feed his paranoia, and push him to act impulsively. I didn't have to wait long. The next night, Laura came home late, looking worn and troubled. I watched her carefully, waiting for her to say something. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "David, I need to be honest with you about something." I nodded, giving her a calm, steady look, as if I didn't already know what was coming. "There have been rumors," she began, stumbling over her words. "Rumors about me and a colleague of mine. They're just that, David, rumors. But it's affecting my job, and it's hurting our relationship." She took a deep breath, her eyes pleading. "I need you to believe me." I raised an eyebrow. "So, what you're saying is that these rumors are hurting you. That's all you have to say." She faltered, her face falling. "David, please, you have to understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," I replied, my voice cold. "I understand that while I've been here, trusting you, you've been running around with Thomas Gray." Her face drained of color, and for the first time, she was silent. "So, Laura," I continued, letting my words sink in, "are you going to keep pretending? Or are you finally ready to face what you've done?" She looked down, defeated. Her hands were shaking as she finally said, "David, I'm sorry. I never wanted it to be like this." I stared at her, feeling a calmness wash over me. "No, you didn't want it to be like this. You wanted to have your cake and eat it too. Well, Laura, it's time for consequences. I'm done playing along." With that, I walked out, leaving her alone with the weight of her own actions. After that confrontation, the air in the house was thick with tension. Laura barely spoke to me, moving about with a kind of haunted nervousness, as though every corner held another bombshell, waiting to go off. But I was only just beginning. I reached out to our lawyer that week, a no-nonsense woman named, and whom I'd known for years through professional circles. I didn't go into details with her, only that I wanted to start preparing for a divorce. I asked her to keep it discreet, and she agreed without hesitation. A few days later, I had one final move to make, meeting Thomas in person. Through a mutual acquaintance, I found out that Thomas frequented a particular cafe downtown. He usually went there around noon on Thursdays, his one-off day from his office. That week, I decided to pay him a visit. I wanted him to know that his actions had consequences, and I was more than ready to deliver them.